Uh-oh! Uh-oh! It's that time of the week! It's Saturday's time! Get ready for Kyle and Drew to blow your freaking minds! We got some college football analytics coming your way! Let's go! Get hyped!
You're listening to the Saturdays podcast presented by Saturdays.com.
Just to recap, we're going over home field advantage, our updated Elo ratings. We have preseason Elo ratings plus week one projections. We're going over an Football Outsiders article by at 903124S, who's talking about rushing and passing correlation and kind of why those two are related on offense. And then we're going to be talking more about spring football and, what we're going to see out of the Big Ten. The president called. So, sorry if you missed all that. Anyways, back to Drew. We're talking about home field advantage now.
Yeah, so we wanted to briefly kind of talk about home field advantage a little bit on today's episode, partially for the reason that we're kind of in an interesting time with the state of college sports. Usually when people measure home field advantage, you don't get the ideal situation, obviously, is you get to play the same exact game with fans and without fans and at maybe two different locations to kind of parse out the different parts of home field advantage. Because when you think of home field advantage, personally I think of, you have crowd and crowd noise. You have how refs interact in that environment based on the crowd, but then also things like travel. So the away team, isn't sleeping in their own bed. They're at a hotel. They're flying on a plane. All sorts of things like that. Could be time differences, time zones. But 2020 is kind of going to give us a somewhat interesting testing ground for home field advantage and to see, what parts of it matter the most. Is it the travel or is it really about the crowds? Because we're going to have a lot of games played with, a small amount of fans or little fans or no fans at all. So something that I kind of found was interesting, there are many different ways to measure home field advantage, and there's no real right way to do it. There's just a bunch of different theories on how to do it. But one article I really liked was written on ESPN, and basically we've talked about in the past about Football Power Index, FPI, and that basically tells you the projected point spread between two teams, neutral field, all of that. So their approach to it was to look at FPI between two teams before the game and then see what the actual result was of the game. So, for example, if the difference between two teams would project maybe 14 points between them, but in the actual game played at Team A's home, it was 17 points. They came up with that 17 minus 14, that 3-point difference there is what they're accounting for in home field advantage. So they're saying before we have FPI, we have the difference that we think, but then when you take home field advantage, what's the actual change? So this is kind of it's a pretty simple way to measure it, but it yielded some what I thought were pretty unique teams that were at the top, because when I would just think about this, I would say, okay, team with the best home field advantage, maybe just the biggest stadiums or what you perceive to be the loudest stadiums. So maybe LSU, Michigan, just for the outright biggest stadium. But the number one team, I don't know if you looked at it yet, Kyle, but the number one team is actually Louisiana Tech. So they had the biggest difference between their home field performance versus expected by FPI. And this was pretty surprising to me because, like I said, I expected just huge schools to be up there. But the biggest school checks in at number 7, Wisconsin. They're the first kind of larger school on there. But you have to go, a bit of the way down to find some of the bigger schools. So that was pretty surprising to me. And I'm curious, Kyle, if you had any thoughts on maybe why it's not just the most people in the stadiums having the biggest home field advantage.
I mean, that is very surprising. I had Penn State at 0.2, which is pretty much no effect at all. And I'd be curious to know if there's any negative effects where it's like you're actually hurt by playing at home.
There actually were, and it's there's like some at the bottom. Louisiana Lafayette is actually last, but Purdue is number 118 out of 120 at minus 2.96. So that means based on their FPI, they would have expected they're actually doing worse at home than their
So they
FPI would
do
project.
better on the road. Do they do better on the road, or this is just only okay?
Just
gotcha.
compared to neutral. Yeah, so
yeah.
not
I
compared
mean,
to road.
so kind of thinking off the top of my head about why this might be, when I think of, at least Penn State in my experience there as a fan, every year the whiteout game is either the Ohio State game or the Michigan game. So right away I'm thinking that these teams are probably used to playing in a pretty hostile environment. Even especially in the Big Ten, a lot of the big teams have big home stadiums as well. So, maybe if you bring in a smaller team and they're playing in this big environment for the first time ever, it can be intense, even for the coaching staff probably. But I think when you've got Michigan and Ohio State that not only at Penn State, but they play at several big stadiums every single year in hostile environments, I think that's where maybe you start to see the effect kind of dampen out a little bit, and they've gotten used to it. It's a little surprising because, you would think that, okay, well, these are college students, so, the teams kind of rotate every 2 or 3 years almost entirely. So you would think like, well, these are mostly young kids coming in and playing in this environment for the first time. They didn't have this in high school. But clearly maybe the coaching is a bigger factor, where if the coaches are prepared and they're not, getting themselves in delay of game situations and, making careless mistakes in their play calling, then maybe that can trickle down to the team as well. So yeah, definitely a very interesting result here that, a team like Louisiana Tech, when I saw Louisiana, I kind of glanced at it at first and I was like, oh, it's probably LSU with a 3.6. And then I thought I misread Penn State and I thought it was like a +2 and it's +0.2. So yeah, I definitely was not expecting that. What are your kind of thoughts on how this is, or do you have the same idea?
Yeah, mostly the same. Just kind of piggybacking off of one of your comments was I thought if you're playing at a large school like Penn State or Michigan, although going to Ohio State at night or going to the whiteout at night might be difficult, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to perform worse. It could be harder to overcome, but they might still overcome it at a pretty consistent rate because you're playing at such a high level. So I think there is kind of a difference there of, the whiteout could be harder to play in, but overall they could still be performing just as well in that environment. And then I was also thinking, I didn't go through the whole list and really separate, Power 5, Group of 5, but one of my thoughts was that if you're in a Power 5 conference, you're treated pretty well when you go to these road games. You're taking private planes, you're staying in great hotels.
Mm-hmm.
So the travel effects might not, come into play as much. And I would want to go back and, really separate out the schools and look at their resources. But that's just one of my thoughts. But I also wanted to add that looking at home field advantage by individual school usually isn't done. I would say this is slightly more unique. Usually in home field advantage, it's difficult enough to get a good measure for all college football teams, just like an average.
Right.
So it's a real big task to kind of go through at the team level, and even like the sample sizes, like Louisiana Tech here, number one, the sample of games is 35 wins and 19 losses. So they're not looking at a huge sample size.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason people don't really focus on the team level. And I think overall it's generally considered about 2 to 3 points of home field advantage is what it's worth.
Right.
But I think it's a really cool effort to kind of break it down by individual school, just to, at least have something to talk about and get a first shot at how to break that down by the school level.
Yeah, and I think maybe one thing that you could look at in this year, where presumably most schools will not have fans or have so few fans that it won't make a noticeable difference on the field, I would think. I think the game last weekend, they had, some fans in the stands, but, it's obviously not going to be a full house, affecting, their ability to hear or make decisions or whatever it is. So I think what we could probably do is look at, the overall home field advantage in college football this year versus the overall home field advantage last year when there were full fans. And then you can kind of find that difference of, well, home teams outscored opponents by 3 points last year on average, and this year it was 2.6 points. And, with maybe, I want to say like 400 or 500 home games in a season on average, you can probably start to tease out the difference that the fans themselves make. And then everything else is kind of the leftover effect of just playing in your home stadium, like you were mentioning. Sleeping in your own bed, being in your own locker room, practice facility, all of that.
Yeah. So for that point there, so if we can break it down, there's a bunch of aspects, but if we want to break it down to crowd noise versus travel versus ref bias because of the crowd, and we'll count like sleeping in your own bed lumped into travel. I'm just curious. There's no right answer, but what is your initial breakdown of how important crowd versus travel versus ref bias would be? Like, what do you think the breakdown is in making up all of home field advantage?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do kind of agree with what you're saying about the travel aspect, where the big schools at least are taking chartered flights, or they're nice coach buses, staying in hotels. But I think there's a lot of a comfort factor of knowing your field, knowing the facilities. So I think that's maybe a third of it. I think the crowd can play a big factor, especially when it comes to delay of games. I think kicking situations. So I would give that slightly more than the travel effect, maybe 40 to 45%. And then the ref bias, I think it goes both ways. I think, they might hear it when they make a bad call, and then they might do a makeup, but I think they're probably going to play it down the middle as much as they can. But then I think another note about the crowd noise is that I think it varies a lot by sport. I think some sports it matters a lot more than others, and I would almost put college football on the matters slightly less, just because everyone is so used to it now. And whether the crowd is loud or not, I don't know that affects a running back's ability to break a tackle or something like that. I think it affects a lot of the before play and the organizing and the formatting, but I don't know that it would affect the in-game action. When you're going up for a catch, is the noise affecting your ability to, track down the ball? A sport that I think actually going on right now that it does make a big difference is tennis, actually, because tennis is such a game of momentum, and it's such a solo sport that you would be surprised and you would think that it doesn't have a big impact. But I'd be really curious to see what the results are, if there are any that come out from the tennis season without fans, because you're so alone on the court, but you're relying on the crowd for your energy. So I can easily see a situation where if you're down 2-0 in tennis, if you're alone, you might just throw in the towel. But if the U.S. Open crowd is behind you, and the crowd always wants the underdog to come back because they want to watch more tennis, then I think that can really help certain types of players to find the energy from the crowd to keep fighting when otherwise they might have given up if it was a game that they were playing on their own.
Yeah, no, I really agree with that, especially with the tennis comment. I think my own breakdown for just those couple, I kind of like how you were describing the crowd, like they're just so used to it. But I would still probably put crowd, and I think there is still something to be said for, the refs being influenced by all of that. So I think I'd put both of them maybe about 40% each, and then like the rest 20% on travel. I think travel kind of goes with your logic on crowd noise, that they're so used to it, is that they do travel all the time.
Yeah.
So like by the 7th travel game that season, they're probably not, as uncomfortable in a hotel room, doing XYZ as they are in the beginning. But, home field advantage does exist. So there's some breakdown. These aren't all the factors probably that you could think of, but there are some, there's true home field advantage in college football. So it's interesting to kind of try to parse it out as much as we can. And this year will be very helpful for that.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to seeing what people come out with about that. And one other note that we wanted to cover here about home field advantage is just to talk about how we handle it with our Elo ratings. So, and you can see this all in the article on our website, but the basic idea is that, with the average of 1,500 that each team has, we add another 55 Elo points to the home team in their matchup. So it's on a game-by-game basis. It's not something that kind of carries over, but we look at each game and we say, okay, who's the home team? And across the board, we give the home team 55 points. So what this equates to is, all else being equal, basically if you had two teams that are equally rated in Elo, then it gives a almost 8% advantage in win probability to the home team. So that's a little less than every 1 in 10 games you're going to give to the home team by default. Not by default, but that's the thinking behind it. So, and if you were a team that's much better than your opponent, maybe you have a 90% win probability to begin with, this is going to add another 2% to your win probability. So you'll go from 90 to 92. Or contrarily, if you're a lesser team that is going up against a big team and you might have a 10% win probability just based on your Elo alone, if you're also playing that game at an away location, then your win probability is going to drop down to 8%. So, Drew, I'm curious to hear what you think about these percentages. When I put them in terms of, your win probability increases 8%, does that sound right to you?
I think the 8%, is for if you have like two 1,500 Elo ranked teams and then you add 55 points to one. So I do think in that situation, if you have two teams who are exactly the same, if they're both average, so if we say they are 1,500 teams, I would say yes. I think that sounds about right. I think that's the other thing to home field advantage. I think they can have more of an advantage against certain types of teams. So if you have two average teams, they're probably not as used to playing in high stakes important games as if you have two even teams with an Elo rating of 1,800 or 1,900.
Yeah, so actually I don't think, and I can check this again, but when I ran this, I think I tested out, 1,500 versus 1,500 versus 2,100 versus 2,100, and I don't think it changed that percentage much. I think it was pretty similar or the same.
Yeah, I don't think it will because it's like the absolute gap between them. But that was where I was going. Is I would say that
there.
for two average teams, I would say 7%, 7.9% is probably a fair guess. Like it doesn't seem too shocking. But yeah, if you have Clemson, Alabama, I would say it's probably less than that. Kind of going back to the big teams know how to play in big games.
Okay. But I think another way to look at it, I think, is like if Alabama and Clemson, let's just say they're completely even teams, which they're close, but we can't say they're even. But let's say they are for this, and they play 10 games. Now, just based on their Elo alone, we'd expect them to go 5-5. But would you be comfortable saying that it's probably going to be 6-4 Alabama if they're playing all the games on Alabama's turf?
Yeah, I guess I would actually, and I guess that kind of lines up more with the 8% advantage. So, yeah, maybe it's if you think about it like that, which is a good way to think about it, and the right way to think about it.
I just thought of it right now. I was trying to think of a good way to put that into perspective, and I finally came up with it. So,
yeah, no, I think if you put it like that, then the 8% maybe. I still don't know if I believe it's equal for two 2,100 ranked teams and two 1,500 ranked teams, but I'm not convinced. I guess they're as different as I once thought. So, yeah, I would say it's still pretty high, but not as much. And I think also that when you move to a 90% win probability, that only changes 2%. I think that's just good to note about Elo rankings is that, adding 50 points when you're tied is not the same as adding 50 Elo points when you already have a gap of 500. It's not just a linear increase in win probability, or else you'd run over 100% win probability all the time.
Yeah, good point there.
Yeah, so I think we can kind of jump to this, I guess, kind of news slash theorizing about the spring, and kind of two little points here together. The first is, would more people, I guess is the right way to put it, opt out in the spring compared to if they had been able to play, or if they are playing in the fall? And then would we care if more people opt out?
Yeah, I think what I was going there is, as fans, are we less likely to watch the game if our favorite players or the big names from the season are not playing? I'll just start off with that one and answer right off the bat. I think there's no way that anyone would care. I mean, I think it'll suck. We already talked about Micah Parsons. I wanted to see Micah Parsons' junior season and see, what he could do. I'm still going to watch Penn State football no matter who's on the field if I don't know any of their names, because I care about the team because I went to the school, not the players. And I think in a lot of cases, that's why people watch college football. They don't really watch for the superstars because they're not superstars yet. You're making superstars in college football. You're watching for the team. So I think on that side, I wouldn't care. And then, the other question is, are more people going to opt out in the spring? I'll also just answer that since I'm going off right now, and I'll just say I think undoubtedly more people are going to opt out in the spring than they would have in the fall. And we already saw a couple big names opt out in the fall. I would expect more of that to come in the spring.
Yeah, so my first question answer is exactly the same. I don't think anyone would care. Like you said, there's a lot of rotation of players already in college football, and it's not like when Saquon Barkley went to the NFL, everyone was like, I'm not going to watch next year because no one can ever be as good as him. You never know, and you don't really – if you did that with college football, you would not want to watch the team after like 3 years anyway, because all your players you knew would be gone. And then also for the opting out in the spring, I think a lot of it depends on what the season is like, obviously, so it's hard to really say.
Right, like if it's 8 games or if it's 10 games, when it starts.
Yeah, exactly. But overall, I would say yes, more people are going to opt out, but I don't think it's going to be as many. It's not like everyone is suddenly going to opt out, because I think we've probably touched on this before, but the people that aren't opting out already for the fall means they think either they just really want to play and they're not too concerned either way, or that they think they have more to prove and need more to prove in order to get drafted. So there's going to be some people who are on the edge. Maybe they were like thinking about opting out and then they decide no. But then when it comes to spring, they'll be like, might as well. But I don't think it's going to be like a flood of people just because it's the spring. I think a lot of people who need to play are still going to need to play.
I agree with that. I think most people probably would have already made their decision by now, although maybe some people haven't vocalized it yet because they thought they had more time. I did see, when they said we want to play, I did see that an LSU wide receiver, and I can't think of his name right now, recently opted out a few days ago. And they're obviously playing in the fall. And I'm not sure what his reasoning was, so I don't want to make him look bad or anything. But I did see someone share a tweet that I guess he did that #WeWantToPlay campaign as well, and then apparently not so much. So I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, we'll see. I think, we've heard Thanksgiving from the Big Ten. We've heard January. I think January is still the more likely option. I don't think Thanksgiving was a long enough wait. And I don't think there's a big deal with that, other than obviously it running into the next season and the concerns about that. But other than that, I mean, the Big Ten hasn't said they're canceling. The Pac-12 hasn't said they're canceling. They're postponing. I'm all for January football. I'm all for the Big Ten bubble. If you didn't hear when we were starting the show because my mic was muted, I guess President Trump called the Big Ten commissioner pleading for an October start date or whatever it was, promising COVID tests, all of that, because apparently that's the most important thing going on in the world right now, and we just need football. And, actually I'm there with you, but yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens. I'm all for the Big Ten bubble. And Another thing.
Yeah, at this point, it's really
Another
tough
thing
to,
about the
really
mic
tough.
going out, I'm actually feeling okay about it because the Eagles did their press conference with Doug Peterson today, and they were having technical difficulties, and they had to like shut it down for a few minutes. So I'm feeling pretty good. Like if they can have their technical difficulties, then we can definitely on our third live show ever. So what were you gonna say? Yeah.
Happens to the best of us. I was just gonna say, following all the Big Ten news is just no one really seems to know anything, so it's even tough to attach on to any plans at this point because everyone's just kind of saying no one's really communicating with anyone, and everyone has different sources who apparently know everything that's about to happen. So we'll just have to wait and see, but I'm sure it seems likely that some sort of Big Ten football will happen within the next 6 months. We'll give it. So I'll just have to wait and see how
Yeah.
it plays out.
So next up, we have our preseason Elo ratings. The article went out, I think, yesterday, and we're going to update it before the start of the weekend because right after we put out the rankings, we did rankings based on the old schedule, kind of to look at, what would the Big Ten have been ranked, what would the Pac-12 have been ranked in the top 25, and then also, like, how many wins could have Penn State gotten with their original schedule or Clemson or whoever it was. So we put all that up on the website. So definitely check it out. I think it's interesting regardless. And then thankfully, CFB Data, College Football Data, where we get our source of all the games information, updated their data for the season right after. So now we have the new schedule. We reran the model. So we have another set of rankings to put out in terms of the teams that are actually playing in the fall. So we're going to look at that a little bit later. But Drew, did you want to talk first about the model updates, just some of the changes that we made to the ELO calculation since we first introduced it?
Yeah, so we've been trying to work on it and just kind of make it better. We've had, a lot of time with the postponement of the season. But I think the main update that everyone should be interested in is originally we kind of initialized all teams to the same 1,500. So, if you were a Power 5 team or a Group of 5 team or a D3 team, you just started off at the same number. But obviously that's not completely accurate. And because of the smaller sample size, especially when it comes to D3 teams, we were getting some kind of weird predictions. We had talked slightly before about a tendency to under-predict home win probabilities when it was right around the middle, like 50%. And part of that reason we think was because, D3 teams weren't really losing a lot of ELO points because they weren't playing a ton of games, but they really are nowhere near a Division I team, and especially not a Power 5 team who they usually play. So we kind of changed the initialization. So Power 5 conferences are still at 1,500. All the Group of 5 conferences we lumped down to about 1,200, and then D3 schools are even lower. I think our final number is around like 500 for them. So it's a big difference between a D3 and a Power 5 school. And the good thing is because the difference is so big, if a D3 team beats a Power 5 team, they'll get a lot of points for that game. So there's still the ability for them to update and become more accurate and higher ranked if that's what they actually are. But it just tremendously improved our predictions. So that was one of our main changes. And also, just to note, we grouped in FBS independents with the Power 5 teams as well. So they're also at 1,500.
Yeah, so that kind of covers the Notre Dame situation. I don't think there's actually that many FBS independents anymore. I think in the database that I was looking at the other day, it's like 5 or 6 teams that were even in that group. So, yeah, so I think that'll definitely make some improvements going forward. And, like we say all the time, we'll continue to kind of, work on it and try to make it as accurate at predicting outcomes as possible. We're already, pretty happy with it. Not to get ahead of ourselves, but, our first newsletter is coming out this week where we're going to be doing game predictions for week 1 and looking at some of the betting lines offered by DraftKings and, saying what we think of the picks, like if it's a good value bet or if, you shouldn't bother with it. And already, we were seeing that our ELO ratings were almost in lockstep with the odds that DraftKings is providing. And we also found that, FPI from ESPN is giving very similar win probabilities to our Elo ratings as well. So that's pretty exciting because it means that we're kind of on the right track and doing something of value. So anyways, we won't get too much into the Elo ratings tonight. You can go on the website, look through the rankings yourself. We have top 25. We have the full list available as well, for including the Big Ten and Pac-12, and then we take them out and show just the teams that are playing. So definitely check that out. Before we get to the article that we're going to talk about, Drew, did you want to talk about the future plans for what we're going to do with Elo going forward?
Yeah, so like you just mentioned, one thing is kind of a weekly newsletter about game predictions and using it for, a kind of a betting approach of finding value in bets. But also something we've been working on this week is kind of season projections and season simulations using the Elo ratings. So now that we have updated schedule data, basically what we can do is use our Elo ratings to simulate all the games that are set to be played in the 2020 football season, and then get expected wins for each team, expected winning percentage, and we're not quite there yet with some of these future features, but eventually we plan to kind of use it to give some rough probabilities for playoff predictions and things like that. So that part's a little more down the road, but with the first set of games that aren't the Power 5 this next week or so, we're going to kind of just make sure that it actually works to update with the real results as well as the projected results, and then hopefully have an article with some of the initial, preseason for most of the Power 5 projections about expected wins and things like that.
Awesome. Very weird week one where there's no Power 5 teams playing and not even, that many Group of 5 teams. So it's like not that exciting, but it is week one, so I'm still excited. Yeah. So anyways, what we're going to do now is we're going to go over an article that we were talking about earlier. This was on Football Outsiders. If you didn't check it out yet, you can go on our Twitter. We tweeted it out earlier today at Saturdays, and you can actually check out the article yourself. But I'm going to put it up right on the screen, and hopefully this works, and we'll be able to go through it and talk about it. So, Drew, do you want to give a little overview of what the article is kind of trying to solve here while I get everything set up?
Yeah, so the basic premise and the question of the article is why are offensive rushing performance and offensive passing performance correlated? So there, is a moderately strong correlation between a offense's rushing success and passing success, which might, seem obvious at first, but the real part of this article is trying to figure out, why is that? What's causing it? It's probably, my initial reaction before reading it was like, oh, well, you can have a great quarterback and a great running back, and they can kind of be independent. But in reality, it's a little more complicated than that. And there's couple different explanations for, theories of why they're so related. And he kind of just goes through and breaks them down of, does the data really hold them up and does it not? So the first one that is kind of gets brought up and relatively quickly dismissed is that hypothesis 1, play action usage leads to better passing efficiency while running the ball more. As you can see with the article, with the graphs right under that first hypothesis, and also the minimal number of text, that one didn't really hold up very well. So the conclusion was, therefore, rushing has no relationship with selling the play fake. So that's kind of something you might have heard before is, if you establish the run, then when you do the play action, defenses are more likely to bite on it. But that's not really held up in the data as his first hypothesis shows.
Yeah, and just to cover what these graphs are showing, here we see total rushes in relation to play. Sorry, what is this? Anyways,
play action
non-play
minus
action yards per
non-play
play.
action
So basically,
yards per play.
how much better are you on your play action plays than your regular passing plays? And you can see that no matter how much you run the ball, it doesn't really affect how effective your play action plays are or how much better they are than your regular passes. No matter how often you run the ball and rushing percentage, and no matter how successful you are, I think this is the biggest killer right here is even if you're a great running team and you're successful, 45% of the time, 40% of the time, meaning on first down, you're getting 5 yards. On second down, you're getting, more than half of what you need to get another first down. On third down, you're picking up first downs. You can still see there's no relationship, exactly 0 R squared there. So no correlation between being good at running and your play action being any more effective. So yeah, first hypothesis, which I think is probably the main one for why are teams better at passing? Oh well, they run the ball so well, so when they set up the fake, their passes go way downfield. Debunked right off the bat. So number 2, go ahead, Drew.
Yeah, so the second hypothesis is that defenses will have more defenders in the box against a good run offense and hence will give up more yards to passing. So the first 2 graphs in this, basically the same thing. So the first one is passing EPA, so expected points added versus men in box in play, 1st and 10. So as there are more men in the box, the passing EPA goes up. So that kind of makes sense. More men in box, they're prepping for the run. So passing EPA is more successful. The second one is just shows the opposite of that. So as men in box decreases, so as they're more prepping for a pass, rushing EPA increases. So that kind of makes you think maybe
EPA decreases here for rushing. As more
men in the box. Yeah, I was saying the opposite. So as less people in the box. Yeah. I was reading it backwards basically. So yeah, as less people are in the box, rushing EPA increases. So that makes you maybe think might be onto something here. But when he puts it on the team level, so when you look at the average men in box faced versus EPA, the correlation kind of looks pretty similar to the charts we just saw slightly further up the article. There isn't really anything strong or predictive at the team level for rushing EPA or passing EPA against number of men in the box faced.
Yeah, so to recap here, on the whole, you can look at this and say, yes, when there's 8 men in the box, passes are more successful than when there's 5, and rushes are less successful than when there's 5. But when you actually track the teams and see, what the results are, for that team, then there's pretty much no guarantee that that's going to be the case for you.
Yep. And then his third hypothesis, offensive linemen who are good at pass blocking are also better at run blocking and boost both passing and rushing offenses. So this also is another one that sounds pretty good. And his approach to because like we mentioned last week, actually,
it's perfect.
it's better for the NFL, but there isn't a great number of stats for offensive linemen. And I think they even mentioned that in the article here that there's just not great data on it. So they looked at a couple different stats to kind of gauge how good offensive linemen are. So sack percentage was one of them. Also looking at interception percentage on the theory that if your quarterback's under more pressure, they're probably going to make more mistakes. And also yards per carry and completion percentage. And the conclusion for this one was slightly better than the others. So at the end of it, it's a pretty mild conclusion. So basically they write, to conclude all the points above, neither play action nor defender count seems to be the culprit, explaining why pass offense is correlated to rushing offense. Therefore, the best conclusion so far seems to be, quote, passing and rushing are correlated because both are based on the performance of offensive linemen, but it's still not exactly clear and needs further work in the future. So it's kind of, the best answer to this question that they came up with. And I think it has, it passes the eye test for me. But I think it kind of speaks to the fact that, it's not easy. There's not always an easy answer for questions like this. And I commend this person for kind of being, reserved in their conclusion too of like what we know and what we don't know.
Yeah, totally. And I think they're on the right track by looking at the offensive line and saying, well, if the offensive line is good at run blocking, maybe they're good at pass blocking, and both sides of the ball are benefiting. But like Drew said, and like we talked about last week, there's very limited data on offensive line, even in the NFL, because this was actually written about NFL data, I believe. So, they said charting of offensive linemen by various companies does not go very far and may not be adjusting correctly for team level performance. So basically, it's messy data. It's from multiple sources. A lot of common problems that you deal with when working with data. So, they did the best that they could with sack percentage because they thought that might hint at how the offensive line is doing if they're allowing a lot of sacks. I already saw people in the comments going off and saying, well, sacks can be affected by the quarterback. If you have a mobile quarterback, then you can have a terrible offensive line that has a low sack percentage. So, that's definitely something that's conflating this variable and taking the effect out of the offensive line there. It would actually be interesting to look at line yards and see if that has any relationship to passing offense now that I think about it, going off of last week.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, I think the most interesting thing in this article for me was the graph of rushing success rate and that play action point, because you really would think that if teams are super successful rushing, there's got to be some benefit when it comes to passing, but it's just literally non-existent there with an R squared of 0. So I found that super fascinating because it went against kind of what I had imagined prior to reading.
Well, it makes you wonder why you would do play action ever if it doesn't really do any better or worse than your normal passes. So I guess obviously that's not exactly true, because there are points here where some teams are getting 4 more yards on their play action than their passes. So there's still a reason to do it, but if you're doing play action because you've been running the ball a lot and you think it's going to throw them off, that might not necessarily be the case.
Yeah, and we did get one comment here asking, would this be different for college? Big skill gap between the NFL and college. And I think, speaking on the play action, that could be an area where, I don't think anyone's looked at it necessarily for college, but you could imagine that in a college setting, people are maybe more likely to bite on play action or things like that, where you don't have, the 10 years experience playing in the NFL and seeing kind of different plays and different players. In college, you have much younger players, and I can imagine that maybe in that case, when the rushing success rate versus the play action success, I can imagine a situation where that might be kind of a positive relationship.
Yeah, you would think at least a little bit stronger than the NFL's because you have those young guys that aren't as familiar with it. They might not have faced any play action offenses in high school for all we know. But yeah, I think my takeaway is, you mentioned here, you said, do rushing and passing have to be related, or is this kind of just a, just something that we're observing by chance? And I think, the reason that passing and rushing might be related more than any one thing, like the offensive line or the play action or anything like that, might just be that, good teams, especially in college football, but this is looking at the NFL. Good teams are good across the board year after year, and if they're good at passing, they're probably going to be above average at running too. You think of Clemson and any of the top teams in college football. Every year they have good running backs. Every year they have good quarterbacks, and I think that's probably even more so in college than the NFL. But then when you look at the individual team, it doesn't mean that you're going to see that relationship on every single team that you look at, but across the board, across the entire league, then I think you get to see those relationships a little bit clearer.
Yeah, and I think another point here, it says rushing, rushing versus passing. And I'm not sure if rushing is limited to running backs, but if it's not, and these charts also show QB rushes, I think that could also be one explanation for why having a good
Right.
passing offense is correlated with a good rushing offense, especially now. Today's game is very much catered to having a mobile quarterback, whereas in the past, I don't think it was as necessary or as wanted by teams. But now I feel like it's not a definite requirement, but most quarterbacks now have some high level of mobility. So in that case, if they're a good passing quarterback and they're mobile, they're going to help the rushing side of the ball. And I think that could be an explanation. I'm not, like I said, I'm not sure if quarterbacks are
I
included
didn't
in the
see
rush.
that mentioned,
But
so I'm not
that would
sure.
be one. It didn't say they excluded quarterbacks, so I assume they're in there. But yeah, not completely sure. But that's just another thought about the difference between the game today and maybe 20 years ago. We would see some different trends.
Yeah, it just says rushing, so it would be interesting to know if they did or did not exclude quarterbacks, and if so, like see it the other way and see if that changes the results at all. Because I think the strongest correlation that they found between rushing and a different metric was interception percentage, where like if the interception percentage went down, then the rushing success went up. So I think that is kind of interesting as well, where that's not really, you wouldn't think interceptions are related to the line as much as say sacks, but in this case that had a better indication of how the running back would do than something like sacks that you would think would affect the line more.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well with that I think we've come to the end of our show. Thank you everyone so much for listening. A few plugs. We have, like we said, our first newsletter coming out this weekend for the Week 1 games. We do actually have a pick. I wasn't so sure because all of our win probabilities were in line with DraftKings, but we did find one game that we're going to bet on. So we're really excited to see if we can put our money where our mouth is and see how it turns out. So if you haven't subscribed yet, it's completely free. Go to Saturdays.substack.com. That's Saturdays.substack, substack.com. And you can subscribe there, and you'll get that in your inbox later this week. Podcast comes out tomorrow on Spotify, Apple, Google, wherever you can get your podcast, it's there. And also make sure to follow us on Twitter @Saturdays to keep up to date with all of our latest articles and whatever we're working on. So thank you again for joining, and we will see you after Week 1. Let's go.
All right, see you, everyone.
You're listening to the Saturdays podcast presented by Saturdays.com.